Why you wouldn't survive a day in the Wild West. A bedtime history lesson. Introduction. Welcome to your dream. In a calm, monotonous voice. Close your eyes slowly. Breathe in. Release. Now I'm taking you to the Wild West of the 1870s. But don't worry. You'll only listen in your comfortable bed, safe. Because if we actually went there, you wouldn't even make it through your first day. Now imagine, the sun is just rising. A small town on the Kansas plains, dirt roads, wooden buildings, and you haven't even had breakfast yet. But breakfast isn't really possible anyway, because living in the Wild West was very, very different from those romantic cowboy stories we tell in the modern world. Everything I'm going to tell you tonight is real. But relax, just listen, breathe, and slowly drift off to sleep. Chapter 1. As the sun rises, 5:30 a.m. starting, the day in the Wild West didn't begin with an alarm clock or coffee machine, but with cold. Where you woke up was probably a wooden cabin. Wind blew through the gaps in the walls, because back then, there was no such thing as insulation. Throughout the night, the temperature inside your room would be almost the same as outside. In winter, the water in your glass could be frozen when you woke up in the morning. In summer, even before sunrise, it would be so hot you'd wake up drenched in sweat. Now, it's time to get out of bed. But what's your bed? A memory foam mattress? No. Maybe a reed mat, a thin wool blanket on top. Underneath, hard wood. Every morning you'd wake up with an aching back. When you put your feet on the floor, the first thing you'd feel would be the cold of the wooden floor. Because carpet? That was a luxury. Most homes didn't have it. Your first task would be to light the stove. But your matchbox might have run out. So what would you do? You'd use flint and steel. This process could take 10 to 15 minutes in practice. Your hand would hurt. Your fingers would cramp. But without fire, you couldn't cook or stay warm. After the stove was lit, the first thing you'd do was boil water. But where did the water come from? There was no faucet, of course. If you were lucky, there was a well near your house. If not, you'd have to walk to the nearest stream. And now let me tell you something. You could never be sure how clean that water was. Never. Maybe someone's horses were drinking water upstream. Maybe someone was washing clothes. Maybe an animal had died. But you wouldn't know. There was no microscope. Bacterial infection theory hadn't yet been accepted by most people. You'd boil your water. That was the safest method. But how many people did this every day? Very few. Now it's breakfast time. Forget your modern breakfast. Toast, jam, freshly squeezed orange juice, eggs. These didn't exist. Your breakfast would probably be this: dry biscuits, a type of rock-hard bread called hardtack, salted pork, and if you were very lucky, some beans. Hardtack was so hard it could break your teeth. To eat it, you'd have to dip it in your coffee first, and you'd have to check for insect larvae. Yes, I'm serious. Insect eggs were very common in long-stored hardtack. Salted pork? That was an adventure in itself. It would be so salty that your mouth would pucker at the first bite. But you had no other choice. Without refrigeration, the only way to preserve meat was by salting. If you had coffee, you were lucky. But that coffee was very different from modern coffee. Bitter, harsh. If you could add some sugar, the taste would become a bit more drinkable. But sugar was also an expensive luxury. While eating, flies would buzz around your table. You'd chase them away, but they'd come back. They'd land on your food. You had to get used to this. Chapter 2. Going to work. 7 a.m. You've finished breakfast. Now it's time to go to work. But going to work didn't mean getting in a car and going to an office like today. If you were a farmer, your work started right outside, working in the fields, from sunrise to sunset, 7 days a week. If you were a miner, then real hell began. Shall we go to the mines? Be mentally prepared. Silver mines, gold mines. These were symbols of the Wild West, but the reality was nothing like it appeared. A miner's day would start like this. You'd descend into a dark tunnel, sometimes 100 meters deep, sometimes even deeper. Lighting, one lantern. That's it. The tunnels were narrow, sometimes so narrow you'd have to crawl. The ceiling was low. You were constantly at risk of hitting your head. Air, airless, full of dust. Every breath you took, your lungs absorbed dust. This was called miner's lung. Over the years, breathing would become increasingly difficult. You'd cough, you'd spit blood, and eventually you'd die, usually before your 40s. Working hours, 12, 14 hours a day, sometimes more. Breaks, very few. Maybe 20 minutes for lunch, but even that wasn't guaranteed. Wages, about $3 a day. In today's money, maybe around $100. But you'd have to spend half of that at the company's store, because that was the only place you could shop, and the prices double what they were in the city. Dangers, countless. Tunnel collapse, early detonation of explosives, poisonous gas leaks, flooding. Every day, people died, and it could take hours, sometimes days, to retrieve the body. Now breathe, relax. This is just a story. You're safe. So what about cowboys? What was the romantic cowboy life like? A cowboy's day started at dawn. You'd mount your horse, and for the next 10 to 12 hours, you'd be on that horse, grazing the herd, directing the herd, searching for lost animals. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But in reality, the sun was overhead. No shade. Your hat protected you a bit, but not enough. Sunburns, your lips would crack, your skin would peel. Dust, constant dust. Horses' hooves would kick up dust from the ground. The wind would blow it in your face. It would get in your eyes, your nose, your mouth. Everything would taste like dirt. Water? You'd have some water in your canteen, but it would heat up quickly in the sun. You'd drink lukewarm water with a metallic taste, and you had to use it very carefully, because you couldn't know when you'd reach the next water source. Food? No lunch. You wouldn't eat anything from morning to evening. Maybe you had some dried meat in your pocket. You'd chew on it, but that's all. Your horse? It wasn't just a vehicle, it was your lifesaver. If your horse went lame, got injured, or died, you were finished. Walking in the desert? That meant suicide. And now let me tell you the worst part. Most cowboys were young men, 16, 17, 18 years old. And most didn't reach age 30 before dying. Accidents, disease, violence. The Wild West consumed the young. Chapter 3. Midday, 12:00 p.m. Midday, the sun at its highest point. If you were outside, the temperature could exceed 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees. Finding shade was vital, but trees were sparse, especially on the plains. Now let me tell you about town life. Were Wild West towns exciting places like in the movies? Partly yes, but mostly no. A typical Wild West town would look like this. Main Street, dirt road. When it rained, it would turn to mud. So deep that wagon wheels would get stuck, horses would slip, people would fall. During the dry season, dust clouds. When the wind blew, your visibility would drop to zero. You couldn't open your eyes. You'd try to keep your mouth closed, but dust would still get in. Buildings, mostly wood, hastily built, uneven. Fire risk was very high. When one building caught fire, the wind would spread it quickly. The entire town could turn to ash. And a fire department? None. Buckets and hope. That's all. What was in town? A general store. Everything was sold here. Food, clothing, weapons, ammunition, tobacco. Prices were high because everything was brought from distant cities. Shipping was expensive. A barber, haircuts and tooth extractions were done in the same place. Yes, the barber was also the dentist. Anesthesia? Maybe whiskey, that's all. While your tooth was being pulled, you'd scream in pain, and then you'd get an infection. Most people died from tooth infections. A gun shop. Weapons were sold, because everyone was armed. But this didn't mean constant duels, like shown in movies. In reality, guns were mostly used for hunting, or for self-defense. Duels? Rare. But when they happened, the results were brutal. A saloon. This was the town's social center. Men would gather here. They'd drink whiskey, gamble, fight. What was inside the saloon? Dark. Windows were few and small. The air was smoky, because everyone smoked cigars or cigarettes. Spittoons in every corner. People chewed tobacco and spit. The floor was sticky, covered with dirt and spit. Music? Sometimes there was a piano, but it was usually out of tune. The pianist would play half drunk. The music would reflect that. Gambling? Very common. Poker, faro, blackjack. But cheating was also very common. Decks were marked, dealers cheated. A man who noticed this might draw his gun and open fire on the table. Violence? Not every night, but frequent. Drunks would fight. Knives would be drawn. Guns would be fired. By morning, several people could be injured or dead. And the sheriff? If there was one, he'd intervene. But most towns didn't have a sheriff. Or the sheriff they had was controlled by the town's most powerful gang. Justice? You provided your own justice. Lynching was very common. Did you think someone was guilty? The crowd would gather. You'd find a rope, hang them from the nearest tree. Trial? None. Evidence? None. Just anger and violence. Chapter 4. Afternoon. 3 p.m. The sun is still burning, but the day isn't over. Now let me tell you about women's lives, because women are often overlooked in Wild West stories. A woman's life in the Wild West was perhaps even harder than men's. When you woke up in the morning, your first task was to light the stove, then prepare breakfast, then wash dishes. But washing dishes wasn't turning on the faucet and squirting detergent. You had to carry water from the well or stream, heavy buckets. Every day, you might carry 10 to 15 buckets of water. Your back would ache. Your hands would swell and crack from the water. To heat the water, you'd boil a large pot on the stove. This would take 30 to 40 minutes. You'd have to constantly feed it wood. To wash dishes, you'd put soap in that hot water. What kind of soap? A perfumed soft soap? No. A harsh, burning soap you made yourself. It was made from ash and fat. It would burn and dry your hands. After the dishes were done, laundry time would come. Washing clothes was a day's work. Yes, all day. First, you'd boil water in a large pot. Then you'd throw the dirty laundry in, add soap. And then you'd scrub, beat it on a board, brush. For hours, you'd work until your hands bled. Because those clothes weren't just dirty. They were covered with dust, mud, sweat, sometimes blood. Cleaning required a lot of strength. After cleaning the clothes, you'd have to rinse them. This meant carrying more water, maybe rinsing 5 to 6 times to get the soap completely out, then wringing by hand, twisting and twisting the clothes to get the water out. Your arms would cramp, shake, but you had to continue. Finally, hanging on the clothesline. If there was wind, good. It would dry quickly, but dust would also come, dirtying your freshly washed clothes again. After all this work was done, it would be time to prepare lunch. But preparing food wasn't easy either. No supermarket, no ready-made ingredients. You had to make everything from scratch. Bread, you'd make it yourself. Kneading dough, letting it rise, baking it in the oven. It would take hours. Meat, if available, it would be salted or dried meat. Fresh meat was very rare. Butchering an animal was a big event. The whole town would gather. Meat would be shared, but it would spoil quickly. You had to eat it. Vegetables, if you had a garden, you were lucky. But garden work was also a separate challenge. Watering, weeding, fighting insects, hours every day. You prepared lunch, set the table. The family ate, and then dishes again. This cycle would continue throughout the day, but there were also children. Raising children in the Wild West was a separate tragedy. Infant mortality was very high. 1 in 5 children would die in their first year. Disease, infection, malnutrition. A doctor? Most towns didn't have one. Or if they did, they were miles away and expensive. Most families couldn't afford a doctor. Home remedies were used. Sometimes they worked. Most times they didn't. Mothers would lose their children, and they wouldn't even have time to grieve, because there were other children. There was work. Life went on. As children grew, they were expected to work too. From 5, 6 years old. Small tasks, carrying water, collecting wood, feeding chickens, school. Some towns had them, but not regularly. The teacher would usually stay for a few months, then leave. Children would also go to school seasonally. During harvest time, everyone worked in the fields. Play? Very little. Toys? Almost none. Children would make their own toys. Wooden pieces, stones, sticks. Their imaginations were strong because they had no other choice. Chapter 5. Evening approaches, 6 o'clock p.m. The sun has started to set, but the day isn't over yet. Dinner time. This was the biggest meal of the day. The family would gather. Dinner usually consisted of beans every day, sometimes potatoes, rarely meat, bread. Flavor? Very little. Spices were expensive. Salt was used, but that's all. Meals had simple, monotonous flavors. But hunger is the best spice, they say. And in the Wild West, most people were always hungry. There wasn't enough food, especially in winter months. Winter, the Wild West's most merciless season. In winter, temperatures could drop to -20, even -30 degrees Celsius, -4 to -22 degrees. Houses had no insulation. The stove would be lit, but it could barely heat one room. Other rooms would be freezing. When you went to bed at night, no matter how many blankets you put on, you'd still be cold. When you woke up in the morning, you could even see your breath vapor in the room. Cold wasn't just discomfort, it was deadly. Frostbite, hypothermia. Every winter, people died from the cold, especially the elderly and babies. Food? There was no fresh food in winter. Canned goods prepared from summer would be eaten. Dried fruits, salted meats, pickles, but these could run out too. March and April were the worst months. Winter was over, but spring hadn't come yet. Almost nothing remained in storage. People came close to death by starvation. Diseases also became more common in winter. Common cold, flu, pneumonia, tuberculosis. And treatment? None. You'd just lie down and wait. Either you'd recover or die. Now let's return to summer, because summer also brought its own problems. Heat. Oppressive, unbearable heat. Over 40 degrees Celsius, 140. Without shade, heat stroke was imminent. Insects. In summer, insects were everywhere. Flies, mosquitoes, ticks, scorpions, snakes. Mosquito bites weren't just itchy, they carried malaria, yellow fever, dengue. These diseases could wipe out entire towns. Scorpion sting? Very painful, sometimes fatal, especially for children. Snakes? Rattlesnakes were the most dangerous. One bite could kill within hours. Anti-venom usually didn't exist, or if it did, it was too far away. And now, let me tell you one of the worst. Typhus, carried by ticks. Symptoms: high fever, headache, rash, confusion, and in most cases, death. In the 1800s, typhus epidemics had devastated entire regions. People died en masse. Graves were dug, but weren't enough. Bodies were burned. Chapter 6. Night falls, 8:00 p.m. Darkness is descending, but there's no electricity, no street lamps. Light? Candles or gas lamps, but both were dangerous. Candles could go out from wind or by themselves, and they could start fires. Every year, countless homes were destroyed by candle fires. Gas lamps gave stronger light, but there was a risk of explosion. Explosion. Gas leaks could poison. Dying in your sleep from poisoning was very common. Going outside in the dark at night? Very dangerous. Zero visibility. Roads uneven. Holes, pits. You could break your leg, collide with horses, or worse, encounter someone. Night was the time for criminals, thieves, robbers, killers. Darkness was their ally. The town sheriff might patrol at night, but he was alone, and in the dark, he was also an easy target. In homes, doors were kept bolted, windows closed, guns ready, because at any moment, someone could come. And now let me tell you a truth. In the Wild West, the legal crime rate wasn't very high. That is, there weren't as many bank robberies and train robberies as people think. But the word legal is important, because much violence was never recorded. Someone would be killed, buried in the ground. No one would know or care. Conflicts with Native Americans? That's a separate tragedy. Native Americans were defending their lands. White settlers were invading those lands. The result? Bloody wars. But calling these wars is even difficult, because most of the time, it was no different from massacre. Innocent villages would be raided. Women, children, elderly killed. And this happened from both sides. Whites raided native villages. Natives raided white settlements. Hatred and resentment lasted for generations. Pain, trauma, loss. These were the true legacy of the Wild West. Chapter 7. Bedtime, 10 p.m. Night has fully darkened. Time to sleep. But sleeping wasn't a comfortable experience. Beds were hard. Pillows were thin. Blankets were insufficient. And sounds. Constant sounds. Wind would creak the wooden walls. Animals made noises outside. Owls hooted. Coyotes howled. And sometimes, gunshots. From a distance. Who's shooting? Why? You didn't know. But you got used to it. Because this was part of normal life. In the early morning hours, maybe you'd have a bad dream. You'd wake up in sweat. But you'd try to sleep again. Because with dawn, the same cycle would start again. Chapter 8. Medical realities, horrifying truths. Now let me tell you perhaps the darkest aspect of the Wild West: medicine. Finding a doctor was very difficult. Most towns didn't have a doctor. The nearest doctor might be 50, 100 kilometers away. And to reach that doctor, a journey by horse or wagon lasting hours. If you were sick, that journey could kill you. So if you found a doctor, what could you expect? In the 1870s, medicine was very, very different from today. That microbes cause disease was just beginning to be understood. Most doctors still didn't believe it. Surgery? There might or might not be anesthesia. Chloroform or ether would be used, but if the dose was wrong, it could kill you. Infection control? None. The doctor wouldn't wash his hands, wouldn't sterilize instruments. The infection rate after surgery exceeded 50%. Most patients died not from surgery, but from infection. Painkillers? There was morphine, but it was addictive. Many people became morphine addicts, and then, when they couldn't find more morphine, they died from withdrawal. Common diseases and their treatments: cholera, death from dehydration. Treatment: give water, but usually it wasn't enough. Mortality rate 50%. Diphtheria, throat swells, you can't breathe. Treatment: tracheotomy, cutting your throat and inserting a tube without anesthesia. Survival chance? Low. Smallpox, sores on face and body. Treatment? None. Either you'd recover or die. Even if you survived, your face would be covered with scars. Tuberculosis, lung disease, kills slowly. Treatment? None. You'd suffer for years, cough up blood, lose weight, and eventually die. Dysentery, severe diarrhea, dehydration, death. Treatment? Water. Sometimes enough, usually not. Dental problems? A torture in itself. When a toothache struck, the pain was unbearable. And what would you do? You'd go to the barber. Yes, the barber. He'd take pliers, grip your tooth, and pull. Anesthesia? Maybe he'd give you whiskey, but that's all. Pain? Indescribable. You'd scream, cry, blood would flow. And then, risk of infection. The pulled tooth site would swell, become infected. You'd have a fever, and without treatment, that infection would spread to your jaw, enter your bloodstream, and you'd die. From a tooth infection. Giving birth. One of the greatest dangers for women. Mortality during childbirth was very high. Bleeding, infection, miscarriage. These were very common. There might be a midwife, but she might not be trained. She just had experience. And experience wasn't always enough. When complications arose, a doctor could be called, but it could take hours for him to come. And when he arrived, there might be little he could do. Caesarean? Very rare, and usually fatal, because there was no infection control. Women knew that giving birth carried a risk of death. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Will I survive? Will my baby live? And now let me tell you the saddest statistic: average lifespan. In the 1870s in the Wild West, the average lifespan was between 35-40 years. Yes, only 35 to 40 years. Infant deaths lowered this average. But even if you reached adulthood, living to 50 was considered lucky. Old age? Very rare. Someone at 60 was considered very old, and they were usually full of illnesses and pain. Chapter 9. Travels and Dangers. Now let me tell you about traveling. Going from one place to another. Today this is very easy. Car, train, plane, you can travel hundreds of kilometers in hours. He says, but in the Wild West, travel was an adventure, and often a tragic adventure. If you were traveling on horseback, You could advance maybe 40-50 kilometers a day, but that was under good conditions. If there was a road, if the weather was nice, in bad weather, mud in rain, ice in snow, the road would disappear. Getting lost meant death. Water sources were critical. You had to plan your route according to water sources. Not finding water, dehydration, death. Food, you carried it with you, but it was limited. You could hunt, but you couldn't always find game. Wild animals, bears, mountain lions, wolves, rattlesnakes, all were deadly threats. Thieves, highwaymen, they could be on any road. They'd approach stealthily. They'd want your gun, your money, your horse, and maybe they'd take your life. Travel by stagecoach was a bit safer, but slower, 30 to 40 kilometers per day. Horses would tire. Rest was necessary. You had to take breaks. Rest stops, small inns, usually dirty, filthy places. Bed, full of filth, lice, fleas. You couldn't sleep, but you'd pass out from exhaustion. Food, whatever was given, sometimes edible, most times disgusting. Train travel, that was a bit more modern, but still not comfortable. In the 1870s, trains existed, but they weren't luxurious. If you bought a third-class ticket, wooden benches, uncomfortable, hard. You'd sit for hours. Your back would ache. Your feet would swell. Air, hot inside. Dust, smoke. Windows were open, but that meant more dust. Toilet, primitive, dirty. You wouldn't want to use it, but you'd have to. Food, the train would make short stops at stations. You'd run out, grab something, and get back on before the train moved. Sometimes the train would leave before you finished eating, and you'd have to abandon your meal. And dangers? Train accidents were very common. Rails could be defective. The train would derail, tip over. Those inside would die or be injured. Bridges could collapse. The train would fall into the river. Drowning, crushing, train robberies, also very common. Gangs would stop the train, rob passengers. Those who resisted were shot. Chapter 10. Economy and survival, making money and surviving. That was the basic reality of the Wild West. Why did people go there? For opportunity, gold, silver, land. But in reality, very few became rich. Most people lived and died in poverty. Let's think about a miner's story. You're coming from the east to California to find gold. You're dreaming. You're going to be rich. But reality, thousands of other people are dreaming the same dream. Competition is very high. You find a claim, stake it, start digging. First day, second day, third day, you find nothing. 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, still nothing. Your money is running out. But you don't want to wait, because maybe tomorrow you'll find it. But tomorrow doesn't come. Months pass. Your strength is depleted. Your health deteriorates. And finally, you accept. No goal. Dreams over. What do? Find another job. Maybe work in a store or on a farm. Low wages, long hours. And your life continues like that. The dream of wealth turns into the reality of poverty. But some were lucky. They'd find gold, become rich. So what happened next? Most of the time, they'd lose that money quickly. Gambling, drinking, scammers. The Wild West targeted the newly rich. They'd circle around like vultures, and at the first opportunity, take everything. Who were the real rich? Merchants, landowners, bank owners. They were smart. They'd build the system, and others worked within that system. Chapter 11, Childhood and Education. What would it be like to grow up as a child in the Wild West? Now close your eyes and Imagine you're 6 years old. You wake up in the morning. No play, no school, work. You carry water, heavy buckets. Your small hands try to hold them, spilling. You fill again. You collect wood from the forest. A large bundle on your back. Heavy. Your shoulders hurt. You feed animals, chickens, pigs, cows. It smells disgusting, but you have to do it. Do you want to play? Not allowed. Too much work. In the evening, maybe 1 hour, a short game with wooden pieces, stones, your imagination. School? If you're lucky, you can go a few months a year, but not regularly. School building? 1 room, 1 teacher, all ages together, 6 years old to 16 years old. Educational materials? Very few, maybe a chalkboard. Chalk, a few books. Everyone shares. Teacher, usually a young woman, 18, 19 years old. Not very educated herself, but accepted as a teacher. Salary? Very low, maybe $20, $30 a month. And usually after a few months, she leaves town. A new teacher comes. No educational continuity. Discipline? Harsh. Very harsh. Beatings normal. When children made mistakes, they'd be subjected to the rod. What does a child learn? Reading. Writing. Simple arithmetic. That's all. History. Geography. Science. These were luxuries. Most children never saw them, and most children couldn't finish school. They'd quit at 10, 11 years old, because they needed to work for the family. Girl children would quit earlier, expected to help with housework, and marry early. At 14, 15 years old, marriage, also a separate tragedy. Child bride, child mother. 3 children at 16, 5 children at 20. Aged, tired, exhausted at 25. Boy children? They too started working at a very young age. On farms, in mines, dangerous jobs. Accident rates were very high. Child workers easily got injured or died. But this was an accepted reality. Life was like that. Chapter 12. Loneliness, isolation. One of the least talked about aspects of the Wild West. Loneliness. Imagine, your nearest neighbor is 10 kilometers away. You might wait days to see another human. Families lived on small farms, isolated, disconnected. Days would be the same. Work, eat, sleep. Again. No one to talk to. No social interaction. Only family members. And with them too, you'd discuss the same topics constantly. News? A newspaper might come. But weeks delayed. What's happening in the world? You don't know. You don't care either. Because survival is more important. Women were especially affected by loneliness. All day at home, with children. No adult conversation. No mental stimulation. Some women would lose their minds. Loneliness would drive them crazy. They'd talk to themselves, make imaginary friends, and no one could help, because there was no concept of mental health. They'd be labeled crazy and forgotten. Men were also affected, but they had a few more options. They could go to town, spend time at the saloon. This wasn't a healthy solution either. Alcohol, gambling, violence, loneliness created depression, loss of hope, decreased will to live. Suicide rates were high, but these weren't recorded. A person would disappear. No one would search. Chapter 13. Religion and faith. Religion played an important role in the Wild West. Life was so hard, so merciless, that people needed hope. And religion provided that hope. Churches were small, simple, wooden buildings, simple benches, maybe a bell tower. Priest? Sometimes there was one, sometimes not. Traveling preachers would go from village to village. Here one day, somewhere else the next. Service? Once a week. Sundays. Everyone would gather, not just for worship, but also to socialize. Because the church could be the only social center. See your neighbors, chat, share news. Sermons were long, for hours. The preacher would shout, talk about hellfire, about sins, about Judgment Day. People would listen, be afraid, hope, and continue with their lives. Religion provided comfort. But for some, religion was also a tool of oppression. Moral rules were strictly maintained. Sinners were condemned, ostracized from society. If a woman got pregnant out of wedlock, scandal. She'd be driven from the village. Her life would be ruined. If a man became a slave to gambling or drinking, he'd be disapproved of, but eventually accepted because he was a man. Double standards were everywhere. And Chapter 14, Death and Funerals. Death was part of daily life in the Wild West. People died young, died suddenly, and died often. When someone died, what would happen? Funeral organization was simple. The family would prepare. Undertaker? Some towns had one, but in most places, you do it yourself. A simple wooden box, nailed together. You'd put the body inside. Washing the body, the family would do it. Usually women. They'd wash the body, dress it, prepare it. You had to be quick, because decomposition was fast, especially in summer. Within a few hours, the smell would start. Funeral service? At church or at home? Short, simple, the preacher would say a few words. Prayers would be said and burial. Cemetery? An area outside town. Simple stone or wooden markers. Name, date, sometimes a sentence. Here lies, rest in peace. But many graves remained unmarked. Wood rotted. Stone fell. And who was there was forgotten. Mass graves were also common. When epidemics occurred, dozens of people would be buried together. Quick, inefficient, but necessary. Mourning, hard for the family. Grief was real. But there was no permission to mourn, because life went on. There was war. Survival was priority. A mother could lose her child. She'd cry, mourn. But a week later, she'd be working in the field again, because she had no other choice. Chapter 15, Entertainment and Leisure, almost none. Entertainment in the Wild West, very little. People were very tired. After work, they just wanted to eat and sleep. But sometimes there would be special occasions. A wedding, the town would gather. There would be music, dancing, eating, music, fiddle, guitar, harmonica, simple instruments, simple melodies, dancing, lively, energetic. People would release stress, have fun, until morning. Food, potluck style. Everyone would bring something, share. There would be a feeling of abundance. These kinds of events were rare, a few times a year, but very valuable memories. Other entertainment, storytelling. In the evenings, the family would gather. Someone would tell a story. Adventures, ghosts, legends. Children would be mesmerized. Adults would listen too, because there was no other entertainment. Reading books? If you were literate and could access them, yes, but these were luxuries. Most homes didn't have books. Newspaper? Sometimes it might come. Would be read, reread. Pages would be worn, consumed. Games? Children would invent their own games. Hide and seek, tag. Simple but fun. Adults? Maybe card games, chess, checkers. But even these weren't common. Most of the time, entertainment was just surviving. And that was enough. Chapter 16. Being a woman, living as a woman in the Wild West meant an additional layer of difficulty. Social expectations were strict. A woman's place was at home, raising children, serving her husband. Right to vote? None. Except Wyoming, which gave women voting rights in 1869, but that was an exception. Education? Limited. The thought that girls didn't need much education. Job opportunities? Very few. She could be a teacher, a seamstress, a maid, but wages were less than half of men's. Marriage? Usually the only option. If you didn't marry, you'd become an old maid. You'd have no place in society, and marriage wasn't a guarantee either. Husbands could be harsh, violent, but divorce, nearly impossible, would mean social suicide. Domestic violence was common, but it wasn't talked about. Seen as a family matter, no outside intervention. If a woman wanted to escape, where would she go? No money, no support. She'd return, face more violence. Pregnancy and childbirth? I already told you about these, but I need to emphasize again. This was the leading cause of death for women. Some women would rebel, find their own paths. Women working in saloons, prostitutes. Society looked down on them, but they survived, earned their own money. Some would dress as men, work as cowboys, become soldiers. No one would know. They'd keep the secret until death. These women were brave, but their lives were still hard. Constant hiding, constant fear. What if you're discovered? The Wild West was merciless to women, but some women resisted, survived, and were lost to history. Chapter 17, Minorities and Immigrants. The Wild West wasn't just for white Americans. Chinese immigrants came as red coats, did the most dangerous jobs, blasting work, tunnel digging. Death rates were very high. Wages, half of white workers, sometimes less. Living conditions, in camps, crowded, unhealthy. Disease was common. Discrimination, brutal. Hatred toward Chinese was widespread. Yellow peril propaganda. In some towns, Chinese were forbidden to live. Leave before sundown, signs were posted. Violence, common. Chinese immigrants would be beaten, killed, and perpetrators weren't punished. Mexicans, especially in the Southwest, their land was taken from them through legal means or at gunpoint. Discrimination existed for them too. Second-class citizen treatment, low wages, hard jobs, African Americans. Slavery had ended, but freedom didn't mean equality. Some went west in search of a new beginning. But racism followed. Finding work was hard. Finding shelter was hard. Being safe was hard. There were African American soldiers called Buffalo Soldiers. They served in the West. But even within the army, they faced discrimination. Native Americans. Their story is a separate tragedy. Their lands were invaded. Treaties were broken, forcibly displaced, driven to reservations, barren lands, insufficient resources, hunger, disease, death. Their cultures were suppressed, their languages banned, their children taken and sent to white schools. Kill the Indian, save the man policy. This was genocide. Can't be called anything else. And today, this history is often ignored. Chapter 18, Law and Order, or lack thereof. The idea of law and order in the Wild West was complicated. Some towns had a sheriff, legally elected, would try to ensure justice. But in reality, sheriffs were usually powerless, alone. In a town, maybe only he was there. He could hire deputies, but these were usually volunteers, not paid, not trained. When a crime was committed, what would happen? The sheriff would try to search for the criminal, but vast lands, sparse population, hiding was easy. Even if caught, holding them was difficult. Prisons were primitive. Some towns had only one cell, or none at all. Court? There were traveling judges. Maybe they'd come once a month. maybe less often. A criminal could wait months in jail, in bad conditions, without trial. When a trial happened, it was quick. A jury would be selected, witnesses heard, verdict given, maybe in one day. Punishment, depending on the crime: fine, prison, assassin, or death. Execution, hanging was common. Public, the town would gather to watch. A gallows would be erected. The criminal brought, last words heard, rope around the neck, and drop. Sometimes they'd die immediately. Sometimes the neck wouldn't break. They'd die by strangulation. It would take minutes. Spectators would watch. This was supposed to be a deterrent, but it didn't stop crime. Lynching, unofficial justice. This was much more common. A group of people would decide someone was guilty. They'd capture them, wouldn't try them, directly punish, usually by hanging, but sometimes by burning, beating, torturing, and no one would try to stop it, because they deserved it, thinking laws existed but weren't enforced. The powerful won, the weak lost. Chapter 19, closing, 3 years. Now it's very late, past midnight, in the Wild West. Right now, it would be deep darkness, silence, only the sound of wind, distant sounds of animals. Everyone's sleeping, exhausted. Tomorrow the same cycle will start again. But you, right now, you're lying in your comfortable bed. You're safe, warm, clean. You can drink water from the faucet, get food from the refrigerator, press the light switch. These were beyond luxury in the Wild West. Couldn't even be imagined. Those people lived with so much hardship, suffered so much. Many died young, were forgotten. But thanks to them, we're here today. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and feel grateful, because you're living in the most comfortable period of history. Good night. Chapter 20. For deep sleep. 4 a.m. Are you still awake? Here's more for you. Soil. Everything started with soil. Life in the Wild West was tied to the land. Farmers would plant, but there wasn't always a harvest. Locust invasion would come, all crops destroyed, a year's work gone in hours. Drought, rain would fall for months, soil would crack, crops would dry, animals would die, the family would starve, would be forced to migrate somewhere else. Maybe it would be better, but most of the time, it was the same elsewhere too. Flood, sudden rains, rivers would overflow, sweep away houses, drown people. Nature was merciless, and people were helpless. Chapter 21. Monotonous details. Let's return to the details of daily life. Very boring details. When you woke up in the morning, you'd wash your face. But soap? Harsh. Bad smell. Brushing teeth? Maybe you'd use a stick or your fingers. Toothpaste? None. Breath smell? Everyone's was bad, but no one noticed, because everyone was the same. Combing hair? A simple comb. But lice control was necessary. Lice were very common. Check every day. Clean every day. Getting dressed. Few clothes, maybe 2 sets. One for work, one for Sunday. Washing rare. Clothes smell, sweat, dirt, but you were used to it. Meal preparation. The same things over and over. Beans, bread, sometimes meat. Cooking techniques were simple. Boiling, frying, baking. Flavor? Secondary. The main purpose was survival. Eating. Fast. No time. No luxury to enjoy. Dishes. Again, after every meal, cleaning, constant cleaning, but never really clean. Dust would get everywhere. Work again for hours, eating, exhaustion, sleep. And the next day, the same again. Chapter 22. more monotony. Now let me tell you about a farmer's life over the course of a year. Spring, planting time, soil prepared, seeds planted, hope held. Summer, irrigation, weeding, waiting, hours in the sun. Fall, harvest, if everything went well, gratitude given. Winter, not rest time, repair time, tools repaired, wood cut, preparation done. And then again, the same cycle throughout the year, for years. No change, no excitement, just repetition. This monotony would drive some people crazy, but most accepted it, because this was life. Chapter 23, Calming Thoughts. Now breathe, relax, think. All of this is in the past, gone now. Today, life is much easier, much safer. When you're sick, there's a doctor, medicine, treatment. When you're hungry, you go to your kitchen, open the refrigerator, food is there. When you're thirsty, there's a faucet, clean water, always. When you're tired, you have your comfortable bed, soft, warm blanket, you're safe, protected, lucky. And now, with these thoughts, you can drift off to sleep. Deep, comfortable, peaceful sleep. Good night. Chapter 24. Final repetitions. The Wild West. It was a hard place. People struggled, survived. Many died. But thanks to them, civilizations spread west. Cities were founded, roads built, trains ran, and over time, the Wild West stopped being wild. But the pain, the struggles of their era shouldn't be forgotten, because history shows us who we are. And now that you know the history, you can sleep comfortably, safely. Good night. As the voice slowly fades, silence. Only the sound of your breathing. In, out, comfortable, peace, sleep.